Gloria Glenford was a pleasant, soft-spoken woman. Most folks in the neighborhood respectfully and lovingly referred to her as Mrs. Glow. For 3 years, neighbors only saw her if she was going to church services on Sunday, had a doctor's appointment, or if her food pantry was running low. As they looked out the window or sat on the porch, folks smiled and waved to Mrs. Glow as she slowly made her way to the Fortin Street supermarket. With her cart trailing behind her, she walked 3 blocks to the closest store. She had stopped driving years ago because she could not see like she used to. Mr. Glenford took it upon himself to do all the driving. Mrs. Glow moved to the bustling city of Vince Mill 5 years ago with her husband. They were married for 55 years. Mrs. Glow and her husband owned and operated a school which taught elderly people how to understand and use computers. It was a very lucrative business. However, after COVID-19 swept the world, as if it were an unbridled tornado, their business and other people's revenue sank like an old rusty battleship that could not be revived. Among other things, Mr. and Mrs. Glenford lost their home. They could no longer afford the steep mortgage they paid in the suburban city of Netlip, PA. The money they managed to save over the years dwindled. They had enough savings left to relocate to Vince Mill, New Jersey. They moved into a high-rise apartment building on the 4th floor. The city and the neighborhood they relocated to was quite the opposite of how they lived in the past. But they were grateful to have food and an apartment when many people passed on the street did not. Even though they fell on difficult times during the pandemic, the Glenfords did not want their children to help them because that season in life affected them as well. When their children graduated from college, years ago, they all moved to different states. So, the Glenfords rarely saw their children and grandchildren, unless it was by video call. A year and a half later, Mr. Glenford managed to find a work-at-home job doing what he loved, teaching the elderly. After a busy day, he and Mrs. Glow spent most of their time together. They adjusted very well to their new lifestyle. Whenever possible, they pitched in and helped the community in every way that they could. One fateful day while working in his office, Mr. Glenford became seriously ill. Mrs. Glow quickly called an ambulance. It was determined that Mr. Glenford had a hereditary disease. He never knew about it because he felt great most of the time. The sad thing is, his disease was so rare, the doctors didn't know how to treat him. At the hospital, Mrs. Glow lovingly and faithfully stayed beside her husband day and night until the hospital announced over the loudspeaker, "It is 8 p.m. visiting hours are now over." Mrs. Glow heard the announcement at least 3 times before she agreed to leave his side. 2 weeks later, Mr. Glenford's condition worsened, and then he peacefully passed away. 3 years later, Mrs. Glow made the difficult adjustment of living without the love of her life. She continued helping in the community. The neighbors in the building assisted her too. As the years passed by, Mrs. Glow became less active and stayed indoors more. To keep herself busy, she started drafting a booklet. It was about what she and her husband taught for many years, the simple steps of using computers for seniors. One day, after working on her manual, she looked out the window to rest for a while. After an hour, Mrs. Glow decided to go to the supermarket because the cabinets and the refrigerator were almost empty. It had been almost a month since she went food shopping. She could not put it off any longer. It was a good day to walk because the weather was pleasantly warm. Mrs. Glow went to the pantry, took out her grocery cart, and headed to the store. In the supermarket, Mrs. Glow went down each aisle. Even though Mrs. Glow ate less since she no longer had anyone to share her tasty meals with, she still carefully selected what items she needed. All of a sudden, she remembered that she did not pick up sweet potatoes. Mrs. Glow headed back to the tents outside of the store. It is where the sweet potatoes and other produce were located. Sweet potatoes was one of Mrs. Glow's favorite foods. With a smile on her face, she inspected the sweet potatoes one by one and loaded them into her bag. Her mouth watered as she thought about making mashed sweet potatoes with baked chicken legs and spinach for dinner. When she finished selecting the sweet potatoes, she went back inside the supermarket, retrieved her cart, and paid for the food. After arriving home, Mrs. Glow opened the refrigerator and neatly put the veggies and sweet potatoes in the refrigerator. When she had finished, she went to the bedroom to take a nap. Mrs. Glow said to herself, "I'll start dinner when I wake up." She settled comfortably into her rocking chair and fell asleep. When Mrs. Glow woke up, she washed her face and hands in the bathroom. Next, she went to the kitchen and began washing the sweet potatoes. She carefully rinsed them off one by one and set them on the kitchen counter. Even though she placed them where they would not fall, one of the sweet potatoes began to roll. Mrs. Glow was in shock. That never happened before. Suddenly, the sweet potato stood upright, grew larger, and began to talk. It said, "Good day, my lady. You may eat the other sweet potatoes, but not me. You see, my mission is to keep you company." For a minute, Mrs. Glow was speechless. She said, "Did you just talk?" The sweet potato said, "I sure did, Mrs. Glow." Mrs. Glow wondered, now how did the sweet potato know my name? The sweet potato could hear her thoughts and said, "I know a lot about you, Mrs. Glow." Mrs. Glow said, "Where did you come from?" Sweet potato said, "Right now that's not important. However, you are, and you are loved. Go ahead and put your dinner on. I will stay here with you and keep you company. After you're done with your meal, I have a surprise for you." Mrs. Glow said, "You do?" The sweet potato said, "Yes, I do." After Mrs. Glow finished her delicious meal and tidied up the kitchen, the sweet potato said, "Let's go to the living room. I will meet you there." It immediately disappeared before Mrs. Glow's eyes. Flabbergasted, Mrs. Glow's mouth opened wide and curved into a pleasant smile. She said, "How did it do that?" She hurried to the living room. She was astonished to see that sweet potato had grown even more. It was sitting on the arm of the chair with a guitar. As Mrs. Glow sat down, it began to sing songs that Mrs. Glow loved. Mrs. Glow joined in and sang too. They had a good time. It was the most fun Mrs. Glow had since her beloved husband passed, and her life drastically slowed down. Before Mrs. Glow retired for the night, Sweet Potato closed its eyes and stretched out its right arm. With its hand, it retrieved one of Mrs. Glow's books from the shelf. Sweet Potato said, "You never finished this book. I'll meet you in your bedroom." Once again, it vanished into thin air. Mrs. Glow quickly went to her bedroom. She wanted to see what Sweet Potato had in store for her this time. She was blown away to see it in her bed with the book in its hands. Sweet Potato said, "Come closer, my lady. I know this is one of your favorite books. Let's finish it tonight. Get comfortable, and I will read it to you." Mrs. Glow smiled and said, "Okay." She walked over to her window and grabbed a red, cushioned, wooden stool that her beloved husband made her many years ago. She placed it facing Sweet Potato. After she sat down, Sweet Potato began to read. Almost 2 hours passed before Sweet Potato finished the story. With a smile on her face, her eyes were heavy with sleep. She said, "What a marvelous book. Thank you for reading it to me." Mrs. Glow lay down with the book next to her, pulled the blanket neatly around her waist, and within minutes went to sleep. Seeing she was soundly asleep, Sweet Potato began to shrink and laid comfortably beside her. He did not sleep, but watched over her. The next day, after Mrs. Glow ended her daily writing and having a sumptuous meal, they sang melodiously as Sweet Potato played the strings on the guitar. Afterward, they watched television until it was time to relax for the night. 15 long years, Mrs. Glow and Sweet Potato had a festive time. He had become a cherished, closest friend. Loneliness had been buried under the earth as unwanted trash. One sunny afternoon, after having lunch, Mrs. Glow sat in her favorite chair with Sweet Potato sitting on her lap. She rocked into a peaceful sleep. For hours later, Sweet Potato noticed Mrs. Glow was still sleeping. It was getting closer for her to have dinner. Sweet Potato stretched out his arm and touched Mrs. Glow's face to wake her up. However, Mrs. Glow did not respond. Instead, she sat still. Sweet Potato said, "Oh, Mrs. Glow, you must wait for me." All of a sudden, Sweet Potato sprouted green vines that covered her body. A brilliant light shined in the back of her rocking chair, and then 2 angels appeared. Suddenly, Mrs. Glow woke up smiling. Her clothes glistened. The angels waved their hands over Sweet Potato, and instantaneously it became an angel too. It was covered in vines with beautiful white wings. Mrs. Glow leaped up out of the chair. The room illuminated with a glorious light. Suddenly, her clothing turned into a simple white dress. with the little angel following behind. They all flew right to the window high up into clouds. As they were flying to a place where loneliness doesn't exist, a large, sweet potato appeared and flew into Mrs. Glow's bedroom window. For 1 month, the neighbors had not seen Mrs. Glow. They wondered where she was and alerted the building's manager. The manager called Mrs. Glow's emergency contact, her son Carl. He in turn called his siblings. 1 week later, guilt-ridden from not spending adequate time with Mrs. Glow and providing for her needs, they immediately bought airplane tickets and flew to New Jersey. Worried-bound, they arrived at the airport, retrieved their luggage, and hailed down a cab as fast as they could. The cab driver couldn't get them to Mrs. Glow's house fast enough. When they arrived at Mrs. Glow's apartment building, they went to management's office to get the key to their mother's apartment. As Carl put the key into the lock, his hands shook as if he had frozen hands on a cold wintry day. Finally, his hand stopped shaking enough to turn it and then opened the door. Rushing in the apartment, Mrs. Glow's children ran down the darkened corridor to the living room. They were shocked when they didn't see her. Next, they checked the kitchen and bathroom. Mrs. Glow was not there. They almost tripped over each other, running to Mrs. Glow's bedroom. When they entered the room, they were baffled when all they saw was a large, sweet potato in Mrs. Glow's rocking chair. They could not believe their eyes. They said, "What kind of joke is this?" They all began to wail out aloud. "Mom, where are you?" However, no one answered. Completely perplexed, they ran to management to tell them what they discovered in Mrs. Glow's apartment. However, management was no help. They only gave them 1 month to remove all Mrs. Glow's possessions out of her apartment, so they could rent it out to someone on their waiting list. Fortunately for them, they found Mrs. Glow's paperwork. She had already made burial arrangements, but there was no body to bury, only a large sweet potato that they discovered in Mrs. Glow's bedroom. Mrs. Glow's children decided they would not waste any money. The decision was made. Carl said to his siblings, "Once we get the funeral money, we'll bury the large sweet potato. After all, we must dispose of that thing. We'll say our goodbyes to Mom at the same time." The siblings reluctantly agreed with his unusual plan. The day of Mrs. Glow's funeral, people were stunned to find a huge and small sweet potato lying on top of the brown wooden casket. Frankly, they were appalled at the ghastly scene. At that moment, they whispered to one another they were leaving, but they did not because they loved and admired Mrs. Glow. They deeply missed her. As for Mrs. Glow, she was in a better place. She never had to worry about being left alone again. She looked young and vibrant. So did everyone there. If you want to find Mrs. Glow, you'll find her in an endless, beautiful garden high above the heavens. She will be walking with the angels and her everlasting, heavenly dwelling brothers and sisters. They will be forever in the care of the King.